What is going on, everybody? I am back today to give you guys a list, but also sort of talk about a topic that I thought would be pretty interesting today. And that is the Cannes Film Festival is happening right now. And there are a ton of movies that have been premiering at Cannes and a lot of discussions surrounding movies there. And the big one that I've seen over the past week is Francis Ford Coppola's film Megalopolis had its debut. And it was met with some incredibly polarizing reviews. And this is a movie that Francis Ford has been working on for quite some time now. He's had this idea for years and years, and he's always wanted to get it made. And I think he struggled to get funding up to the point where he ended up spending his own money on making this. And it has Adam Driver and Aubrey Plaza and all these really incredible actors in it. And there are some people saying it's one of the worst movies ever made. There are people saying that it's so bad it's good. There's some people that have called it a masterpiece. It's kind of all over the place. And this is the guy who made The Godfather and Apocalypse Now and some movies that have been heralded as some of the greatest films of all time. And it got me thinking about polarizing films from great directors and movies that have been made by incredible filmmakers that either audiences didn't like but critics liked, or critics hated and audiences loved, and that are just kind of all over the place. And I find that so fascinating. When someone creates a piece of art, it's going to resonate with each and every person differently. And I do think, as someone who critiques thousands of movies, I talk about movies all the time. I've watched thousands of movies in my lifetime, and there are some movies that are just bad. Like, if you look at them from the outside looking in, they're just poorly made, the dialogue's poorly written. There are certain things that are just objectively true about movies. But I do think that any film can impact each individual person in a different way. And so I find that such an interesting concept. And so today I thought it would be fun today to talk about some incredibly polarizing movies between critics and audiences alike that I love from fantastic directors. Directors that have made movies hailed as masterpieces, directors that are typically well regarded in the community, that have made films that have had reviews all over the place that weren't necessarily critically successful. And I'm excited to give you some of those today. So I'm going to start with David Lynch's Inland Empire. David Lynch is my favorite director. I've talked about that multiple times on my channel. I love David Lynch. This is not my favorite movie in David Lynch's catalog. I understand why this movie is so incredibly polarizing, but I respect the hell out of David Lynch for making this movie. David is someone who does not like having restrictions put on him as a filmmaker. He likes to be able to live and breathe his creative process in the fullest way possible. And that's exactly what Inland Empire is. It is a guy who had an idea for something, wanted to put that idea to screen, and did not really edit any of it, didn't really change any of it, just kind of put it out there for the world to see. And honestly, I respect directors that do that. And I don't think this movie completely works as a whole. You have Laura Dern's character, who is really kind of the focal piece of this movie. And there's a through line narrative that exists, but it jumps into all sorts of worlds and planes, gets very psychological. There are moments that really just kind of come out of nowhere that don't necessarily make any sense in the context of the remainder of the movie. And I've watched David Lynch speak on making this movie multiple times about how he had like post-it notes of ideas and different themes that he wanted to try to convey. This was the movie where David abandoned film and went to digital because he thought that digital was way easier to shoot on, and the convenience of editing digital. And you could the quality of the filmmaking in moments is definitely lacking in comparison to his original film. But I think what's really interesting is David is someone whose creative process was limited the entirety of his career. He had Final Cut taken away from him in a couple of instances in movies. People have put pressure on him, even in like when he was making Twin Peaks: The Return, where like the studio's like, hey, you have to wrap this up. Hey, you've got to get this moving. And what's interesting is like, this is David getting the ability to put whatever he wants on screen. And you can feel that. This movie is deeply horrific. There are some absolutely terrifying moments in this movie. There are some beautiful moments of monologue delivery from Laura Dern's character. There are some truly mesmerizing sequences in this film that are some of my favorite in all of David Lynch's catalog. And I think that no matter who you are, if you're a lover of film, you have to experience this movie at least once. It's 3 hours and 10 minutes long. and it is bloated. It's way too long of a movie. There are so many things that could have been cut out, and that David having someone tell him, hey, you could probably edit some of this movie out, probably would have been for the benefit of the entirety of the film as a whole. But I've got to respect David for getting this thing made and how much it like impacted me like in a very like visceral way. Like as I was watching the movie, I felt really intense emotions throughout all of it, and you could see there was a lot David was trying to get out in this movie. And yeah, I think it's a really fascinating piece of film, and one I'd recommend to anyone check out at least once. Up next is Ari Aster's Beau is Afraid. A lot of you might tell me Ari Aster hasn't been in the game for that long, he hasn't made a whole lot of movies. Beau is Afraid is only his third film, but 3 films is a lot to make. It's a long process. It takes a while. Hereditary was critically acclaimed. People absolutely loved it. Midsummer got fantastic reviews. People absolutely adored it. Beau is Afraid was all over the place. I feel like critics' reviews and audience reviews alike, they didn't know how to perceive this movie because it was vastly different than anything Ari Aster has ever made in his career. And I loved this movie. I think that it is an anxiety-inducing nightmare. I think the way that it portrays this very toxic relationship between a mother and a son is very easy to relate to and very easy to understand the character's motivation. Joaquin Phoenix's performance in this film was incredibly understated. I think that he was amazing. Everything that his character had to go through in this movie, you could just feel that level of anxiety and that level of emotional manipulation that the character faced, that just like really for the entire 3-hour runtime didn't sit well with me. It was like you can tell that there's a lot of personal experience coming out from Ari Aster's life in this movie. There's so many movies you can watch that you can just feel the personal nature of them, and this is 100% one of those movies. The middle section of this film has some of my favorite shots in recent film history. Just like incredible. The whole stage play performance that he stumbles upon. The different styles of filmmaking that are utilized in those moments are great. The way humor is incorporated in this movie is fantastic. I thought Nathan Lane's performance was one of the highlights of this movie. He was cracking me up through the entirety of the runtime of the film. And it is about 3 hours long, and I will say, even in revisiting this, there are things that could be trimmed out and moved around a little bit to make the film a little bit more impactful and easier for audiences to digest. But this movie reminds me a lot of like Charlie Kaufman or David Lynch, where this is a director putting ideas directly from their head onto the screen in a way that works for them. And not all of it is through dialogue. A lot of it is just through the visuals, and you'll either get it or you don't. And it's like, it's fine either way. But I feel like in this specific circumstance, you have to respect the hell out of the guy for really going for it, because Hereditary and Midsummer both have elements that fit general audiences. Like you watch those movies and you can say, okay, they're both horror films centered around trauma that no matter who you are, an audience can get something out of both of those movies. This is much more far reaching in a way that's like, okay, people might be able to relate to this, but it could be a lot more difficult. And it's just a movie I've thought about ever since I watched it the first time, and I'm really looking forward to revisiting it multiple times in the future. Up next is The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou from director Wes Anderson. I talk all the time about how Wes Anderson is one of the filmmakers who made me fall in love with movie making. He's one of the reasons why I went to film school and one of the reasons why I'm so analytical about film. He's someone who's completely and totally embraced a style, and the style is so well known that you can go into a theater, sit down, not read a title card sequence, and know that you're watching a Wes Anderson movie. Steve Zissou is probably his only critical flop. It's probably the only movie that has negative reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. Like with a splat review, I think this thing still sits at like a 58 or a 59%. And amongst audiences as well, it's probably his most divisive film, and it's my favorite movie he's made. I don't necessarily think it's his best movie he's made, but it's the one that impacted me the most deeply. I think this relationship that it shows between a father and an estranged son is just so palpable and realistic in a way that's almost uncomfortably personal. And I love that about the movie. I love when Wes can get very emotional with his movies. And obviously a lot of Wes's charm is the deadpan deadpan dialogue, but there's something about this movie and the way that he approaches these characters that just feels very real and beautiful. There's a sequence towards the third act with Bill Murray's character that is one of my favorites in the entire history of film. I love the soundtrack choices in this movie. This is one of Wes's earlier films that cost him the most money, and he talks about having that amount of money and really thinking that that was a struggle making this movie, is like he went kind of too overboard with the visuals. But I love the visuals in this movie, especially like when you're looking at the ship and like all of the intricate details in the set design. It's just beautiful to look at, and it's a movie that every time I come back and revisit it, I find something new to appreciate with it. And I'm honestly kind of surprised this movie didn't do better, because amongst Wes Anderson fans, I feel like this one's always in kind of the upper echelon. People seem to really like it. But amongst just film lovers, it seems to kind of fall at the bottom of the list, or people just don't appreciate it as much. And I hope this is a movie that as the years go on, people find a way to appreciate more. Up next, and I won't go into too much detail about this movie, but Luca Guadagnino's Suspiria. I have talked about this movie 500,000 times on my YouTube channel. You guys out there know, who have been following me for a while, this is one of my favorite movies ever made. I like this more than the original in about every regard, and I'm really kind of surprised. Luca Guadagnino is a critically beloved director. You look at Challengers recently, it's probably one of the most loved movies of the year. Call Me By Your Name was nominated for multiple Academy Awards, just regarded as an absolutely incredible film. And this is a movie in Luca's catalog that is all over the place when it comes to the reviews. It did horrible in the box office. People did not come out to watch this movie, and I love everything about it, from the creativity and the visual presentation to the amazing performances to the gut-wrenching storyline that is beautifully dramatic to the incredible Tom York score. Everything about this movie works so well together to create an immersive experience. There's a large allegory for the war going on at the time period in this film, with the divide in the houses of the witches that exist in this ballet academy. There's so much symbolism layered throughout the film, and it's incredible that Luca even got this movie made. But the fact that he took such a beloved piece of property like Dario Argento's Suspiria, which is really just an aesthetically pleasing, beautiful film that's also incredibly horrifying, and he's like, okay, I'm going to do my own version of that. So he took elements from the original Suspiria, but made it's his completely own thing. And that's what I complain so much about with horror movie remakes, is that people don't try hard enough to make it their own unique piece of art. And Luca did it perfectly. Tilda Swinton gives one of my favorite performances of all time in this movie, playing three characters. Dakota Johnson's incredible in this. Mia Goth, Chloe Grace Moretz. Everyone in this movie is just fantastic. And it's a film that I never stop thinking about. And if you've never seen it before, I highly recommend to anyone who's a fan of film to watch it at least once. Up next is another one of my favorite movies of all time, and that's Charlie Kaufman's Synecdoche, New York. I feel like this movie now, later on, since its release, has gotten a lot more love, and people understand the significance of the film a lot more than it was initially when it was initially released. This movie was a critical failure. I think it made like $2 million in the box office, and it had like a $10 or $11 million budget. It did not do very well, and the critics' reviews were all over the place when this movie was released. I don't think a lot of people knew how to interpret it. I think a lot of people were lost as to what was going on. And Charlie Kaufman is a director that is not afraid to put everything he is feeling on screen. And this movie is just an examination of about any and everything you can think of in regards to mental health and the human condition. This movie looks at existential dread in a way that is so incredibly uncomfortable. Every time I watch this movie, it moves me even more and kind of just makes me think even more. The last sequence in this film is one of the most beautiful sequences in a movie I've ever seen. There's so many thoughtful monologues in this movie in relation to just like life on this planet and how human beings treat one another. There's also this really like introspective idea of this artist creating this piece of art, trying to understand all the people that live around him and the experiences that they're having and what they're trying to obtain from life on this planet. And I think Kaufman is really like exploring empathy in a very realistic way, and also like is willing to get into the more dour, depressing nature of it all. And like, what if there is no point to all of this? Like, what if we're just here and we're here for nothing? But it's not necessarily all doom and gloom. There's also moments that are a lot lighter and less heavy. I think it's impressive to be able to examine all of those different things in like a 2 hour long movie. Philip Seymour Hoffman is remarkable in this movie. It's one of my favorite performances he gave in his entire career. And it's just a film I never stopped thinking about. And I'm kind of surprised it was a flop. I feel like this is a movie that no matter what, like, you have to respect the ambition behind it. And it's a movie I feel like is just going to gain more love as the years go on. And not to keep you here forever, I will do one more, and that is The House That Jack Built from director Lars von Trier. Lars von Trier is obviously a director that has a lot of controversy around him. He hasn't made the best decisions in his career as far as how he publicly speaks. He said some things in his life that they just baffles me, but he's an incredibly talented artist who makes incredibly thought-provoking and beautiful art, and he is critically respected, especially for a lot of his earlier work. When you look at Melancholia, Dancer in the Dark, a lot of movies that he's made that have really resonated with people. The House That Jack Built is a movie that had multiple walkouts at the Cannes Film Festival, people talking about how it was just completely disgusting and awful. Critic reviews were all over the place when this was first released, and I think this movie is amazing. It's one of the best depictions of a serial killer in a film in an almost uncomfortable way, depicting the serial killer's OCD, even like thinking about how he cleaned up scenes after he murders people. It's very violent and brutal in a very like relentless way. It showcases its violence and never pulls back from it. The performances in this movie are stellar. I understand people get upset in some of like the more self-indulgent moments where he'll incorporate shots from his own filmography in his movie, but that's Lars. Like, if you're not ready for that at this point, you don't understand his art. He's clearly self-involved. But aside from that, I think it's a really engaging story that it's really easy to follow. And if you're into like serial killer true crime movies, you're going to really enjoy this one because it pulls zero punches. And there's some of the most horrific imagery I've ever seen in a movie in this film. And I'm kind of surprised, knowing Lars and the types of movies that he's made in the past, that this movie wasn't critically more well received. But it's a film that I've grown to appreciate more over the years as I've watched it more times. So what are some polarizing films that you love? Let me know in the comments. I think this is such a fascinating subject to discuss, and there are obviously a lot more films that I didn't include on this list. As always, if you can like the video and subscribe to the channel, helps me out a lot and lets me know the type of content you're looking for. I'm always putting out new material and look forward to getting more out for you in the near future. And as always, everyone, thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.